Support for the CivicSciTV network comes from listeners and viewers like you, and organizations such as the Rita Allen Foundation, which invests in transformative ideas in their earliest stages to leverage their growth and promote breakthrough solutions to significant problems. Go to ritaallen.org to learn more.
Mapping the ongoing work across the civic science landscape by characterizing the why, what, how, who, when, and where through talking directly with practitioners in academia, government, for-profit, and non-profit organizations. I'm Fanuel Muindi, and this is Questions of the Day.
Previously on Questions of the Day.
And it's strategic in the best possible sense of the word, which is to say that making sure that we're clear on our goals, that we're not just like, I'm going to correct misinformation. Well, that's not really a goal. Why do you want to correct misinformation? Misinformation about what? And so that what I would love funders to be thinking about is how do we make sure that scientists, we're not just training scientists to speak clearly and hoping for the best, that we're giving scientists the help, the strategic help to think through, like, yeah, why am I putting time and energy?
Subscribe to access that conversation and many more.
Hey, it's Fanuel here, your host of Questions of the Day. Now, today we meet up with Dr. Bruce Lewenstein, who is a professor in the Department of Communication at Cornell University. Now, it's always great meeting up with Bruce, especially given that he specializes in the history of public communication of science. I mean, that's just amazing. And we actually meet up with him at the 2025 AAAS annual conference in Boston, my hometown. So for those of you watching, you will see people walking by and even saying hi to Bruce. A lot of people know him. And so we are in the trenches at the AAAS meeting, and I'm thankful to them for letting me do this. So why are we talking to Dr. Lewenstein? And yes, it is actually Lewenstein.
Lewenstein or Lewenstein?
I say Lewenstein.
Stein, okay.
Yeah.
The conversation deals with the recently published Nature paper around trust in scientists, and they did this across 60 countries for the first time. And we actually talked to John Besley recently, and I encourage you to check out that conversation. The questions are basically the same. What's actionable and for whom? Okay, I won't ruin it, okay? Take a listen. Here is Dr. Lewenstein.
Bruce, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah.
So this paper comes out looking at trust in scientists, and we'll get into that.
Yep.
It's not trust in science, and
Yep.
we made a distinction about that. That came out, and everybody's reading it. At least I think everybody's reading it. You've taken a look. You've
Yep.
seen the headlines as well, and the punchline is that trust is actually pretty high. And so I wanted to get your thoughts, initial thoughts, and put it in context too, because you're a historian of science. Where have we come from with respect to this question about trust in scientists?
Yeah. So paper came out, and there was a certain sense of, no surprises here. For people who've been following along, we've known for a long time that trust in science, at least in the places where it has been measured, is pretty good. One of the real strong points of this paper is it pushed a lot further as to places where we measure it.
Because it
went global, and particularly went global south.
Right.
So it's not just the U.S. and Europe, and maybe Japan, maybe China. It's 68 countries.
Right.
So just the amount of work it took to do that is amazing.
Yes. 71,000 something people.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So the first, but given that, okay, so it turns out that what we know here in the U.S. and Europe is more or less what we know elsewhere. We know from other data that trust in all institutions is down over the last 50 years. Science, and I think scientists are still at the top, but they're lower than they were. This data isn't comparative, so we don't know exactly what it would look like. So that was one reaction. Then there were a couple of bits in it that were useful, or I don't say useful, there were a lot in it that was useful. There were a couple of bits in it that really struck me. One was there's not anything specific we can correlate with.
Okay.
There's a variety, it's not, maybe men tend to be a little less trustful of scientists. people with particular attitudes about how society should be structured, a little bit different. But it goes up and down. It's not a national-based thing.
Right.
That's what I meant by sort of couldn't correlate. It confirmed that trust and other attitudes and behaviors, it's not a strong predictor. So that we have to we talk a lot about trust.
Right.
We have to be careful we don't talk only about trust.
Right. Right.
It didn't attempt to measure knowledge, and there are two ways of thinking about that. One, it's just too hard.
The paper would have been much longer.
The paper would have been much longer. The interview was already 18 minutes. They said the average was, I haven't noticed that detail, it took 18 minutes for people to fill out the survey. That's about as long as you can keep people.
Yeah, and actually the pretest they found was 14
Well, 14,
minutes.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And when they added a couple of questions, all right, that's a problem. So adding, but the knowledge questions, we know from other studies, don't predict knowledge. They don't predict attitudes and behaviors very well. So it's okay that, at one level, it's okay that they didn't measure it. On the other side, we do have concerns that we had this wonderful 40-year time series of knowledge questions, and we're losing that. We haven't continued that, at least in the U.S. I've been talking with a colleague of my former student of mine from China, who wants to try to do those kinds of studies in China, and he said, "Why is the U.S. not doing that anymore?"
So you talk about literacy, right? Science literacy.
Science literacy,
right?
Yeah, the sort of standard 10 questions. Right. Does the Earth go around the sun, or the sun go around the Earth? Kind of questions. We know that those aren't terribly predictive. On the other hand, it's really hard for some of us to let go of paying attention to those issues. And so, on the one hand, I get why this study made no attempt to do that, and I think that was probably the right decision from a looking forward research point of view.
In a way, also, I mean, they start off saying actually the prevailing notion, right? It's trust is like everything is at the bottom, right? And they're saying actually, now we're talking about trust in scientists, and they make the effort, as I said earlier, to differentiate that. They're talking about the people doing the work, right? Yeah. Not the institutions.
And that's, well, it's not just not the institutions. They make the point that when the part of the problem with asking about science is it's not clear, are you talking about science as a body of knowledge, science as a way of knowing the world, science as an institution or set of institutions? They actually had a fourth option. I can't remember what it was offhand. And so it's not clear what you're asking about. Right. If you ask, do you trust science?
So sidestep that confusion.
So sidestep that. Yeah. So now we just say scientist. They didn't get into the questions about who's a scientist. Yeah. So we know from other work, for example, that if you ask people to describe scientists, they will often describe to you a person with a white coat who comes into the room and gives you the answer to a question. And gives you the person with a white coat comes into the room, gives you the answer to a question. Right. Sounds an awful lot like a doctor. All right. And so the question of who's a scientist, how much of the technical workforce do we include? Do we include all the people who work in R&D, especially the D part? So they don't get into that. So there's some complexity even to asking them about, do you trust scientists?
Right. I wonder, is that the right question? Trust in scientists? Is there another way to frame this question that could be more, to avoid this confusion that people have? Because I think the prevailing notion is that, it's low, right? But the data is showing some other way, right?
Yeah, no, I think this is a classic case of people may think or talk about the fact that it's low,
Mhm.
But if we're scientists and we go look for and we go look at data, it does mean we have to ask the question, then why is there this prevailing opinion? And that leads us to start asking questions about science as an institution and the way people identify with it, and the way they can. There's a tribal component to it. We scientists have to stick together, and people don't trust us, and in terms of our identities in the tribe, well, no, data's not important. Membership in the tribe is important,
Right.
And we have to recognize that. I mean, part of what that does is it tells us, okay, science is a set of institutions. It is other things, but it is also a set of institutions.
Right.
Scientists are members of that community. I should call it a community, not a tribe, but they're members of that community. And with that comes various norms about what behavior, about expectations. It's a community that has a particular self-identity as people who know something about the world, people who are committed to some kind of factual approach to the world, and trying to make sense out of that. I mean, I think this does get us, but it still makes sense to ask about trust. But this actually then gets into, without going into the weeds of the paper, one of the things that it does is it's actually fairly careful about what it means by trust, and
because it breaks it down, right? 4 dimensions, a
four
12-point scale,
four dimensions,
right, right.
and those are all validated scales, and and so I'm not going to go into the weeds on that part because I'm not a quantitative person, and I don't. But what I think that points to is that when we use the word trust, there are these different pieces of it that we have to pay attention to.
And I think this nuance is important, right? Because I think you have to read the paper first of all, right? Because they do break it down, and there's a figure 1, for example, has all the countries.
All the countries,
Egypt is at the top right there. It's a 1 to 5 scale, and so if you're not careful, you really need to read the methods and understand what that means, right?
Yeah.
They say it's high, but they actually do put in a lot of nuance that is in there, right? About if there's a low trust in some groups, right? High overall it could look like this, but it might be low in some areas, and that could be enough.
It could be enough.
A small minority could drive.
They make the point, at one point they say, if 10% distrust, that can be enough to start creating challenges for the community, for the country or the group. And if it gets to 25%, I think they called that a tipping point. And so that we're not talking, in that sense, the scientific community is right to be worried about any distrust.
Right.
And even 10% distrust or lack of trust is a problem.
So we shouldn't take it for granted in a way. The way I read this is, yes, you got this, it's high, but don't take it for granted, first of all, right? This can change, number one, and given where we are right now, just as we see things change. And so that's, I think, part of what I've been thinking about is what is actionable from this work, right? And I'm thinking about policymakers, I'm thinking about funders who are supporting the science and society work, right?
Yep.
What are your thoughts on action items, right? What's actionable from this?
So what's actionable is to think about what are the parts of scientists, because that's all we know about, because that's what the study was about.
Yes.
What are the parts of that we can affect? So we know, for example, from other work, that transparency can, and showing competence in technical skills is part of how you build trust. So both the technical and the transparency.
Right.
And so the transparency piece is a piece where especially funders can be especially helpful in encouraging scientists to be transparent. For example, this study was pre-registered, right? They stated in advance what they were looking for and what would count as success for their hypotheses.
And I would pause and say there were, I think, 241 authors.
Yes.
Of this paper.
Yeah. It was a huge Yeah, there was a team of about 10 or core. A lot of those were just the local people. But
which is important, right?
Yeah,
They're local.
they were local people. But and I will also say they had some findings that were post hoc analyses, but they were very careful to identify those.
Right.
But my main point is that open science of pre-registered studies and so forth is a form of transparency. So for funders to encourage that, for funders to encourage open access.
And the paper is open access,
the
actually,
paper,
which I was like so happy to see.
yeah. That's very tricky. We also then have to talk about, we have to have discussions with publics about what that means to do open science. So I just had in my undergraduate seminar this semester, one of the first articles I had them read had to do with public understanding of preprints.
Oh, wow.
Public doesn't understand preprints, that they don't know what that means. 16 senior undergraduates at an Ivy League university in the United States were a little unsure about what preprints are.
Okay.
Many of them science students, or had done a lot of courses.
Interesting.
Yeah. So a lot of people, even our student community, doesn't really understand some of these elements of the scientific system and what transparency would mean. So that might be a place where we could be putting some effort into saying, what kinds of projects can we do in curricula, in public communication, that might in funders' requirements for what is part of your project, that people can commit to.
I'm mentioning journals as well, where I think PNAS has this, maybe the broader impacts discussions, right? Journals did that. There are a number of journals which have essentially a why this matters thing now that they put in top. And I think that would be something to encourage. And the reason I keep coming back to funders is because that's how you get people to do things, is saying, you get money for this, and if you don't do it, you don't get money. And that turns out to be a powerful motivator. How about communicators, people who are doing the engagement work?
Right. So for people who are doing the engagement work, it says, what this says is that focusing on the transparency is, and really pushing hard to get scientists to talk is important. Talking about the technical expertise is important. And then we get to a complicated one.
Let's hear it.
Those are easy. Those are easy.
Those are easy.
So what we know from some other studies about uncertainty and public response to uncertainty is that if the public perceives that there's a lack of consensus, that leads to distrust in the science, not the scientists, but in the science, I see. Although they're probably somewhat related. And so that then puts a burden on the communicators to say, what are the uncertainties? Why is there this disagreement? What does that say about the overall field? Many years ago, it's probably 10 years ago, a reporter for Vox, when Julia Belluz wrote a paper, this is pre-COVID, wrote a paper about covering vaccine research. She wrote a story, rather, about covering vaccine research, and what she said was, it's a problem for me. There's a lot of interesting studies in vaccine research. There's a lot of uncertainties in vaccine research. There's a lot of challenges. But anytime I write a story that indicates there's any question about a particular detail of a particular approach to making a particular vaccine, boom, all of a sudden that is a piece of evidence for any anti-vaxxer. She said, well, what I'm trying to do is say the reason I can trust vaccine research is precisely because they're asking, because they're working through these questions in the research before they actually make the vaccine.
The variability. We were just a preview of a talk that we're going to go to later about communicating uncertainty visually for scientists, right? And I was recently at a talk with Brian Southwell, about misinformation, because that variability, right, is enough to start driving all these questions and so forth.
Yeah.
So are you saying communicators, like, we need more investment, number one, but also communicators focusing on how do we...
They need to think about that we need to cover the they have to find ways, and I don't have a good answer for talking about uncertainty. What I think they have to not do is present science as certain. The scientists say
rigid,
this, because that's precisely when trust in scientists goes down, is when people who are not scientists say, but there's a conflict here. So if you're not acknowledging that conflict, then why should I trust you? So this is, so 40 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, a historian of science named Marcella Follett published a book called In Our Own Image. It was a study of magazine coverage of science in the 20th century, first 2/3 of the 20th century. And one of her arguments was that the presentation of science was too positive. It didn't acknowledge the uncertainties. It didn't acknowledge the complexities. Can I interrupt myself a second? Clive, that was a nice session.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Yeah.
Because we are live here at the AAAS. So
we're in a hallway, so I'm saying hello to people. Somebody I've known for 35 years. I want to say hello to them.
We love it.
So Marcella Follett's argument in her book was that the coverage of science has been too positive. And as a result, when people see disagreements or they see potential problems, and they feel that the scientists haven't acknowledged those, then that's a reason to distrust. And there are demonstrable times where science has produced what at the time seemed to be the right answers, and then later turn out not to be. I can't remember if this is one of her examples, but DDT, right? A drug or a pesticide that was, I'm not sure if it was a pesticide or an herbicide, that was widely used, very successful for accomplishing its goals, fairly quickly recognized that it had ecological effects that maybe were not so good, and health impacts that were maybe not so good, and eventually was banned. It's the basis of Rachel Carson's classic book, Silent Spring, which is now more than 60 years old, in terms of the start, what often credited as the start of the environmental movement. But when people realize, oh, this thing that scientists said was good isn't. When Rachel Carson was given, shortly after the book came out, someone who was receiving an award for science writing used his award acceptance speech to attack her for not doing good science. We now know that he was wrong, but that was someone from within the science communication community who was attacking a scientist and she was a scientist. She wasn't a PhD scientist, but she had been, for much of her career, she was a working scientist at the Fish and Wildlife Service. For showing that science isn't quite as simple and certain as it sometimes seems, and that there can be unexpected, unintended consequences of scientific work. I'm not even talking about the times when science has done things that are in the moment demonstrably
because you have that too.
Demonstrably racist or colonialist or whatever. So I think science communicators part of the story they need to be telling is about the complexity of science and the complexity of scientists, complexity of motives that they have, the complexity of the work they do. So basic science, basic discovery science, depending on how you count, is 10 to 20% of science. That's important to know.
Yeah.
And yet we have this image of saying, it's about curiosity, it's about discovery. Well, yes, sometimes. For a lot of people who are scientists, it's about getting a paycheck so that they can go home and have a family and eat and have a home and all those things.
The full pic, I imagine like an iceberg, right? Where if you're not careful, you can be talking about just the tip, but there's a whole mass below it, right? And especially the dead ends, right?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about my own work when I was a graduate student. I mean, things just didn't work.
Things just didn't work, and that is part of it. And and that also gets to something scientists have to confront, which is, if a PhD student does an experiment and it doesn't work, they've still learned. Yeah, they should still get their PhD, even if it didn't lead to a publication. Oh, and by the way, maybe it should have led to a publication. There should be the Journal of Failed Experiments.
And that's a whole conversation we can have about that too.
Yeah, because that is in fact a big part of what science is about. The frustrations and the and it doesn't mean science isn't working. But this is again where you build trust, is with the transparency and showing that frustration, showing the failures. So there's a profile that just came out, I guess in the New York Times, of Felicia, what's her name? Wolf Simons, the woman who reported finding arsenic life, and was essentially hounded out of the scientific community for work. Without passing judgment on whether the work was right or wrong, hounding someone out because they did something that made it through peer review at Science magazine, that's not, there was no fraud. There might have been poor judgment. On the other hand, there was poor judgment of a major review system as well. I'm actually quite horrified that in this story, apparently the editor of Science is 20 years, 15 years later, considering having the paper withdrawn.
So what you're talking about is really like, there's a whole like life cycle that like you should be communicating and then sharing and inviting, right, the community into that process.
Into that process. I understand why should I trust the scientists?
Right.
Because these are the things they do in order to see whether their work is acceptable or is reliable. Yeah. I like to talk about reliable knowledge, that's what science is. And I think insofar as communicators can say, how do I build trust? What can I do that might contribute to trust? Looking at those dimensions of trust that are measured in the paper, and some of which are things like transparency, can get to, okay, so maybe that's something I can focus on in my research. The other thing that is a big part of the paper, we haven't talked too much about, I've referred to, it talks about people who have who support a hierarchical structure of society, support a vision where there are people who are in control, right, and they have the right to look down at other people. Some of us would view that as authoritarianism, and again, we've known for a long time. One of my students who did this work, Dominique Broussard, that
whom we talked to yesterday, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I have to look for her. She's a panel this afternoon, I think.
Yes.
But Dominique's work was distinguishing between people who have more or less authoritarian views of how decisions should be made in society. So one of the things that this leads us to, both her work and then this what was in this paper about the hierarchical society, is recognizing that we actually have ways of characterizing different people and different groups in society. And so one of the actionable things might be, okay, how do we think about communicating with these different groups? They're not identifiable directly, although maybe they have, are there different media that they consume? Are there different TikTok channels they follow? I don't know. That's where, but I have to say, okay, so maybe there are different ways of approaching this. I'm remembering once sitting at the car dealership, or the car repair shop, and sitting the pile of magazines that was sitting there while I waited for my car.
Been there.
Yeah. One of which was Deer Hunter magazine or something like that, not a field that I know anything about. But there turned out to be a really interesting article in it about the eyesight and the color perceptions of deer. And it was a good science writing story. And it was, I don't want to use the word target in this case. It was directed at exactly the right audience. This was, here's a way we can talk about science this is something that's going to be of interest to this particular community. Okay, so how can we think about, are there things about scientists that we could talk about? So there are a lot of natural resources scientists who are active hunters, who are active, they love many of the same things that people who we often associate with a particular political structure, we can be talking with them. Can we do the same thing with this sort of authoritarian, hierarchical view of society approach? I don't know, but and that would be a place where I would start looking.
Yeah. So paper has opened up.
Paper opens up all these kinds of questions. And then, of course, it opens up all of the international comparative work. Okay, we've now got this overview of 68 countries. Now let's dive into some of the specific countries, especially ones where we haven't studied as much, but which are really big countries. And so, yeah, it was interesting. The survey was done almost entirely online, except in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
And allowed French and English, main language.
With the main language.
They talk about as a limitation.
As a limitation, although they also said they translated it into 37 languages. So I was a little, that was one of that little methodological details I was uncertain about. But in the DRC, they had to do it in person.
Right.
I'm interested. That's the only country you couldn't do it online. I mean, some of those other countries also do not have great internet infrastructures. So what was going on there? So there are things like that that'd be worth digging into.
Yeah, man, I wish we could just keep on talking, Bruce, about this. So what is the hope for you with this paper, and then many others that follow after this?
So first off, I hope it gets widely read. I hope it can contribute to a conversation that says, let's stop clutching our pearls about trust. People trust scientists. Let's talk instead about what are the things that lead to that trust, and how can we build that even more. And insofar as there are people who don't trust scientists, what are the things that are elements of trust that we can focus on for trying to help people build more trust in science, which is an assumption that we want more people to trust in science. One of the things that we have to be very careful about is most of us who are talking about this have strong commitments to science. We are part of that community.
Right.
Part of the point is there are people who are not part of that community, and if we believe in democracy, those people's positions matter. And we have to somehow put ourselves in their mind of why, if they are interested in science? Are they distrustful of science? Do they simply not care? And why? And what are the ways that we have to think about them?
Right.
That's a real challenge for us, because we assume that we want to build trust in science. And part of the argument of some people who, that small minority, but nonetheless sometimes vocal,
Right.
minority who don't trust science is maybe there are good reasons not to.
So we really need to, like, one, don't take it for granted,
Mhm.
first of all. And I hear you this about just going through and looking at that trust, what makes it trustworthy, and different groups and
So
why
I-
others do not trust it, to really understand it, right?
Mhm.
So we should keep up the work, right?
We should keep up the work. Again, if we look at these different countries, we should say, oh, are there certain countries that we actually need to devote resources in those countries because there is, in fact, a bigger problem in those countries.
And bring in more countries,
And
actually,
then you're right.
expand this.
Yeah, looked like most of the funding came from the Swiss National Foundation. I couldn't quite tell, but international. Bring in more countries, learn more. There were some hints about some regional variation. So maybe we should look at those and try to understand, okay, let's dig into that and see if there's more correlational things we can do there.
Right.
But yeah, as with any good piece of research, it leads to more questions.
Yes. Yeah. Great questions. Bruce, thank you so much. Till next time.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Fanuel.